Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric. Here we are all about unconventional commander decks, and I think it's finally time to start discussing the new commanders from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. And today I want to talk about Liesa, Forgotten Archangel. Liesa is a 4/5 angel with flying and lifelink that costs 2 white/black, and it has, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. And also, if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. Okay, so Liesa is probably one of the most powerful new commanders from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Her ability to recur your dead creatures back to your hand when they die can generate a ton of value. And Liesa is sort of like one of those Phyrexian Praetors. Because not only does she enhance your creatures' deaths, she also punishes your opponent's creatures dying by making them go into the exile instead of to the graveyard. And this is actually surprisingly relevant, as there are lots and lots of decks that utilize graveyard recursion, at least as a sub-theme. So there's a pretty good chance that Liesa's second ability will negatively affect at least one of your opponents most games. Now, if we check out EDHREC, there's a few different ways that people are building Liesa right now. First, there's an Aristocrats deck, which is pretty much like every other Orzhov deck, but with a few Liesa-specific inclusions. You'll use creatures that like to die and creatures that reward you when they die, and you'll use sacrifice outlets so you can kill your own creatures on demand to generate value and then return them to your hand with Liesa and do it all over again next turn. And actually this deck seems pretty scary, since you'll use things like Plaguecrafter to make each player sacrifice a creature. Of course you'll sacrifice Plaguecrafter, then Liesa will return it to your hand at the end of the turn so you can use it again next turn. You can use evoke creatures like Shriekmaw to kill another creature for only 2 mana, and again Shriekmaw returns to your hand with Liesa, so you can do it again. Now, another popular way to build Liesa is Shadowborn Apostles. A deck can include any number of cards named Shadowborn Apostle, and if you sacrifice 6 of them, you can search your library for any demon card and put it onto the battlefield. And of course, if Liesa is on the battlefield when you sacrifice those Apostles, you get to return them to your hand, so you can reuse them, which is also pretty strong. Now I wanted to take Liesa in a different direction. Because Liesa lets you return your creatures to your hand when they die, you can repeatedly trigger enters the battlefield effects by sacrificing and recasting your creatures. But on the other hand, white is already really good at blinking creatures, and if you use these blink effects, you don't need to pay the mana to recast the creature just to get that ETB effect again. So a Liesa blink deck is probably not that optimal. But there are some creatures that have on-cast effects. Now these work perfectly with Liesa because you can't trigger these effects by blinking the creature. But killing these creatures and then recasting them will let you get repeated value from their on-cast effects. And most of these creatures that do something when you cast them are Eldrazi. So that means we're going to build an Eldrazi tribal deck with Liesa, Forgotten Archangel in the command zone. Let's talk about why you might want to do that. There are many Eldrazi that have abilities that trigger when you cast them. Like we said, blink effects won't trigger these, the creature actually has to be cast. But the spell doesn't need to resolve either. Any on-cast effect will resolve before the creature actually enters the battlefield, and if the spell is countered, the on-cast effect still happens too, which is awesome. A Bearer of Silence, for example, lets you pay 1 and a colorless when you cast it, and if you do, target opponent sacrifices a creature. When you cast Artisan of Kozilek, you get to return another creature card from your graveyard directly to the battlefield. And it's also a 10/9 with Annihilator too, so that's great. Oblivion Sower lets you exile the top 4 cards of an opponent's library, and you get to put all lands that player owns in exile into play under your control. Eldrazi with Emerge are also great with Liesa. These creatures let you sacrifice another creature in addition to paying their Emerge cost to cast them. If you do, the creature's casting cost is reduced by the mana cost of the sacrificed creature. For example, if you sacrifice a Callous Blood Mage to pay the Emerge cost for Abundant Maw, then Abundant Maw's Emerge cost is reduced by 2 and a black. So instead of paying 6 and a black, you'll only need to pay 4 generic mana. And with Liesa in play, that Callous Blood Mage that you sacrificed will come back to your hand at the end of the turn. And these Emerge creatures have on-cast effects, so you'll get repeated value if you manage to cast them over and over. Abundant Maw lets you have target opponent lose 3 life and you gain 3 life, which isn't amazing, but it's fine. And then you can cast Distended Mindbender to have target opponent reveal their hand and discard 2 non-land cards of your choice. One of those cards has to have mana value 3 or less, and the other one has to have mana value 4 or greater. So that's pretty nice. And as far as emerge creatures are concerned, well, that's about it. We don't have access to too many of them in white and black, and there aren't many in the game to begin with. But there's plenty of other Eldrazi with cast triggers. Conduit of Ruin, for example, lets you search your library for a colorless creature with mana value 7 or greater, and put that card on top of your library when you cast it. And this is great, because of course we'll play the big 3 Eldrazi Titans, which also have on-cast effects. Like Kozilek the Great Distortion, which costs 8 and 2 colorless, and it's a 12/12 with Menace. And when you cast it, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. And you can also discard a card to counter a spell with mana value X, where X is the mana value of the card you discarded. There's Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, which costs 10, and it's a 10/10 with Indestructible. When you cast it, you get to exile 2 target permanents, and when it attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of their library. And of course, we'll get Emrakul, the Promised End, the biggest, baddest Eldrazi Titan. It's a 13/13 for 13 mana. It has flying, trample, and protection from instants, which is surprisingly relevant since people prefer to run instant speed, single target removal. It costs 1 less to cast for each card type among cards in your graveyard, and when you cast it, you gain control of target opponent during their next turn, so that's fun. And then that player gets to take an extra turn after that turn, if they're still alive. These 3 Eldrazi Titans will win you games, and with a Sacrifice Outlet and Liesa, you can protect them by sacrificing them rather than letting someone path to exile them or something. And then Liesa lets you return them to your hand, so you can cast them again and get repeated value out of those devastating on-cast triggers. These guys are easily your biggest payoff for playing Eldrazi Tribal, and they'll do even more work with Liesa in the command zone. I will point out, though, that we're not using Kozilek Butcher of Truth or Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, since these ones shuffle themselves into your library whenever they're put into the graveyard. Liesa won't be able to return them to your hand, since her ability doesn't return the creature from the graveyard to your hand until the end of the turn, and by that time they'll be shuffled back into your library already. But there's lots of other cool stuff we can do with Liesa and Eldrazi, besides just abusing on-cast triggers. Let's talk about those things next. Now there's a few Eldrazi creatures that can take advantage of your opponents having cards in exile. And this is really cool with Liesa, because she happens to exile your opponent's creatures whenever they die. For example, when Mindbreaker enters the battlefield, you can put a card an opponent owns from exile into its owner's graveyard. And if you do, each opponent discards a card. So if you can keep Liesa in play for a while, your opponents are pretty likely to have stuff in exile that you can use with cards like Mindbreaker. We'll also use Blightherder, which lets you put 2 cards your opponents own from exile into their owner's graveyards when it enters the battlefield, and if you do, you get to make 3 1/1 Eldrazi Scion tokens that can be sacrificed for 1 generic mana each, so this is pretty good ramp. And then there's Wasteland Strangler, and then when this one enters the battlefield, you can put a card an opponent owns from exile into his owner's graveyard, and if you do, you can have target creature get +3/-3 until end of turn, so this can kill small creatures for you. Now honestly, these Eldrazi processor creatures are not terribly amazing in Commander, but they do generate pretty much free value for you just by doing what your deck already wants to do, by keeping your commander on the battlefield. And because these abilities are enters the battlefield effects, you can trigger them repeatedly as long as your opponents have cards in exile, by sacrificing these creatures and returning them to your hand with Liesa and recasting them. And finally, there are some situational but hilarious things these processors can do. You'll notice that they let you put cards your opponents own in exile into their owner's graveyard, but they don't actually care how those cards got into exile. For example, if you're playing against the new popular Rakdos commander, Prosper Tomebound, your opponents will be exiling a card from their library at least once each turn. Your processors can yank those cards out of exile and put them into their owner's graveyard, then your opponent doesn't get to cast them. Or maybe some blue player decides to suspend an Ancestral Vision for some delayed value card draw. Your processors can just take that Ancestral Vision out of exile, dump it into their graveyard, and prevent it from resolving. Again, situational, but hilarious. Okay, so we mentioned that in order to get these repeated on-cast and enter the battlefield effects from our Eldrazi, they'll need to die, and then Liesa will need to ensure that they go back to our hand so we can cast them again. So of course we'll play with some sacrifice outlets, and some other cards that like to be sacrificed. Let's talk about those next. Not all of our Eldrazi do things when we cast them. Some just like to die, and Liesa likes it when our creatures die, so let's make it happen. Extricator of Sin lets you sacrifice another permanent when it enters the battlefield, and again, if you have Liesa out, you'll get that creature back to your hand. And if you do this, Extricator of Sin makes a 3/2 Eldrazi horror token. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, Extricator of Sin transforms into Extricator of Flesh. This is an Eldrazi horror that gives all of your Eldrazi vigilance, and you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice a non-Eldrazi creature to create a 3/2 Eldrazi horror. Now, even though this is an Eldrazi tribal deck, we have plenty of non-Eldrazi creatures we can sacrifice to it, and again with Liesa we'll just get those creatures right back to our hand. We'll also use Matter Reshaper. This is a 4-mana 3/3 Eldrazi, and when it dies you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a permanent with mana value 3 or less, you put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, you put it in your hand. There's Pawn of Ulamog and Sifter of Skulls. These don't let us sacrifice creatures, but they reward us when our creatures die. Both of these let you create an Eldrazi token that can be sacrificed for a colorless mana whenever one of your non-token creatures dies. And there's plenty of other non-Eldrazi creatures that like to die too. A Burnished Heart sacrifices itself to ramp you for 2 basic lands out of your deck and into play, and this artifact elk is reusable if you've got Liesa in play, which is great. Cathar Commando is a new one from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It's a 2-mana 3/1, which is fine. It has Flash, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now the Flash here is awesome. Because Liesa returns your dead creatures to your hand at the end of the turn, you'll normally need to wait until your next turn to recast and reuse those creatures. But creatures with Flash, like Cathar Commando, can be cast during any player's turn. So you'll be able to repeatedly cast and sacrifice Cathar Commando once on each player's turn, limited only by your available mana. We've got Night Incarnate. That's one of those evoke creatures. When it leaves the battlefield, all creatures get -3/-3 until end of turn, and you can evoke it for 3 and a black. That means you sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. So with Liesa around, this is a repeatable mini board wipe for 4 mana, and it won't kill your commander or any of your big Eldrazi. And of course anything of yours that it does kill, well, you'll get it right back to your hand with your commander in play. So there are plenty of creatures that like to die in Orzhov colors, and I've chosen a few to include here that supplement the Eldrazi theme, with a few of our missing basic deck functions like ramp and removal. But again, there are tons of these creatures to pick from, and you don't need to use the specific ones I've chosen here. Now, of course, with creatures that like to die, we will need sacrifice outlets. And again, there's no shortage of these in Orzhov colors. Yahenni Undying Partisan and High Market are great instant speed reusable sacrifice outlets. I've also chosen to include Etchings of the Chosen. This is an enchantment that lets you choose a creature type, and creatures of the chosen type get +1/+1. And you can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature of the chosen type to have target creature you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So we'll typically pick Eldrazi as our creature type, and then Etchings of the Chosen will let us sacrifice any of our Eldrazi, maybe one that we can recast for some value, or maybe just sacrifice an Eldrazi spawn token or something to help protect Liesa by giving her indestructible. We'll also include some single-use sacrifice outlets. I like Village Rites and Plum the Forbidden since they're instant speed and will help you keep your hand filled. A Disciple of Bolas is also great with some of our larger Eldrazi because it let us draw lots of cards all at once. But again, there's lots of sacrifice outlets in Orzhov colors, so feel free to use other ones instead if you prefer. Now let's talk about some of the other synergistic cards that we're using to round out this deck. So even though our primary focus is on Eldrazi, our commander still gives us lots of value by letting us reuse our dead creatures. So I want to help fill this deck's card draw and removal slots with as many of these creatures as I can. Scourge of the Skyclaves is probably the most exciting non-Eldrazi inclusion in this deck. It's a 2-mana demon with a kicker cost of 4 and a black, When you cast Scourge of the Skyclaves, if it was kicked, each player loses half of their life rounded up. And Scourge of the Skyclaves has power and toughness, each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. So this guy is awesome here. First, it'll decimate everyone's life total when you cast it. And then, if anyone has more than 20 life afterwards, it'll immediately die since its toughness will be less than 1. So then if you've got Liesa out, Scourge of the Skyclaves will return to your hand. And then you can cast it again and again, once each turn, to just keep halving everyone's life total. I also really like Blackland's Paragon. This is a 3/1 knight with flash that costs 1 and a black, and when it enters the battlefield, target knight you control gets Death Touch and lifelink until end of turn. So again, the flash here is really awesome. You can flash Blackland's Paragon in to block an attacking creature, and then have it give itself Death Touch to kill that attacker. Then Liesa returns it to your hand at the end of the turn, and then you can cast it again on your next opponent's turn if you need to. This will make it very hard for your opponents to attack into you profitably without some sort of evasion like flying or unblockable. We'll also play Foulmire Knight. Adventure cards are really great here, because you can cast the adventure side of the card and then the creature side. And then if the creature dies, you can return it to your hand with Liesa, so you can reuse the adventure side over and over. Foulmire Knight is a great blocker with its Death Touch, and the adventure side of the card will help you keep your hand filled. I'm also using Giant Killer for the same reason. With your commander, this is repeated removal with Chop Down. This is a 3-mana instant that destroys a target creature with power 4 or greater. I also really like Shepherd of the Flock. This is a dorky 3/1 vanilla human, but the adventure is also a 1-mana instant that lets you return a permanent you control to your hand. This is perfect to protect your commander or to let you recast one of your creatures with an on-cast trigger. Now, since this deck really values our creatures dying and returning to our hand, we'll use a few pieces of recursion outside of our commander for a bit of redundancy. Palace Siege, Phyrexian Reclamation, Raise the Draugr. All of these will help us keep our creatures out of the graveyard for too long, even if Liesa isn't on the battlefield. And that's most of the deck. As usual, I'm not mentioning every single card in the deck, but you can check out the link in the description to the full deck list. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Liesa Eldrazi tribal deck has an average mana value of 3.45. This deck has 35 creatures, and 19 of those are Eldrazi. And we do have a couple more cards that make Eldrazi tokens, like Pawn of Ulamog. Eldrazi tend to cost a lot of mana, so many of our lower mana value creatures, and our utility creatures that provide card draw or removal or something, a lot of these are not Eldrazi. We have 9 sacrifice outlets. That's including our emerge creatures and other creatures that have enters the battlefield or on-cast effects that let you sacrifice another creature. This deck has 11 sources of card draw and 14 sources of ramp. Again, those Eldrazi are expensive, so we will need lots of ramp in this deck. That's good though, since our commander also costs 5 mana and needs to stay on the battlefield a while to provide value, so all that ramp will help us cast Liesa several times from the command zone if we need to. And finally, we have 11 sources of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $216.62 on tcgplayer.com. Now, I've tried to keep this deck reasonably budget friendly, or at least as budget friendly as we can be when we're playing with the Eldrazi Titans. I don't have any recommendations to reduce the deck budget, because the deck loses a lot of flavor and winning potential if you take out the most expensive cards in the deck, those 3 Eldrazi Titans. But if budget is less of a concern for you, there are a few cards you might consider adding. First, Delphi Voidwalker is really powerful on its own, but it's even more powerful with Liesa since you can use it over and over again. And because Delphi Voidwalker is exiling cards and putting void counters on them, and you can sacrifice it to let you cast a card with a void counter on it from exile, you can let Delphi Voidwalker die and recast it, and you can still sacrifice it again to cast a card that was previously exiled with it. It doesn't matter if this iteration of Delphi Voidwalker didn't actually exile those cards. Creatures like Selfless Spirit make it really hard for your opponents to wipe out your battlefield, since you can sacrifice the spirit to make all of your other creatures indestructible until end of turn, and of course return the dead spirit to your hand with Liesa to use it over and over again. And Kokusho the Evening Star is just mean. Whenever it dies, each opponent loses 5 life, and you gain that much life. That's 15 life most of the time in a 4-player game. And of course there's Yawgmoth, which is a great sacrifice outlet and card draw all in one. The only thing I would caution with this build is not to load up the deck with too many of these good stuff creatures, at least if you want to play this as an Eldrazi tribal deck rather than just a generic Liesa deck. Alright, so that is Liesa, Forgotten Archangel. This is a pretty powerful commander, and it needs to stick around on the battlefield a while to really provide value. This is generally a combination I'm hesitant to play, since your opponents will be incentivized to remove it, and that'll really limit the value you get from your commander. That said, the reward is well worth it with Liesa, and if we're dropping Eldrazi haymakers like Artisan of Kozilek and Ulamog and all of these, we'll really be pressuring our opponents to decide which is the greater threat and demands removal more immediately, our commander or these giant Eldrazi. And again, we're playing a lot of ramp in this deck to help us cast those big Eldrazi, and that also helps us pay the commander tax to keep Liesa in play as much as possible. But I don't have too much more to say about this deck. It's a lot of fun to play. We're kind of combining the regular Orzhov Aristocrats style of play with the heavy-hitting Eldrazi tribal, and having access to a couple of colors in an Eldrazi tribal deck, rather than just being purely colorless, means we'll be able to play a lot of white and black's really efficient removal spells that we wouldn't have access to in a colorless deck. But that is all I've got for today. Come back next time for some more unconventional decks from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. I'm currently working on a build for Slogurk the Overslime. I'd also really like to play with Danik Pious Apprentice, but he's also kind of weak, so we'll see. Definitely let me know in the comments if there's any commander or mechanic from Innistrad Midnight Hunt that you'd like to see a deck built around, especially an unconventional deck. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.